And now it's Deborah Kobylt Live and Little Italy Podcast.
Hey, everybody. Thanks for joining us today on Deborah Kobylt Live and our Little Italy podcast. I am joined by James Pierre and Ken Atchity. James wrote this incredible Bible, Gambino, The Rise. And I say Bible because look at this. It's amazing. And on the side, he just happens to be a financial manager. How you find the time for all this, I'm not quite sure. Ken is a literary manager and producer and is behind some of the best known films in Hollywood. Welcome, both of you, on our shows today. Pleasure.
Thank you, Deborah.
Thank you, Deborah.
Thank you.
Good to be here.
Now, what I love, James, you've always been a student, as you call yourself, right, of the mob. How did that happen? And you're sort of an unlikely guy because, you know, the first time I talked to you, I expected you to be like this Italian guy. And you're not, right? But you grew up in Brooklyn. You grew up in Brooklyn around lots of Italian people and families. So tell us, what inspired you to write this?
So around the age of 12, my parents, they moved from Glenwood to Canarsie. We lived on we lived on East 57th Street between Avenue K and L. I attended Roy H. Mann Junior High School during that time, and it was just an Italian enclave there. There were a lot of Italian families. I had some Italian friends, and there were a lot of whisperings always going around. You know what I mean? There were a lot of mob whisperings, but things that I really couldn't identify with until one night when I was going to a relative's house in nearby Mill Basin, which is the section of Brooklyn that's right near Canarsie. And I witnessed an actual mob hit on my way to his house. And that's when that opened my eyes, and things that I had heard in the past, hanging out with my Italian friends, started to make sense after that. And that's when I started researching the mob and really getting into it.
Hang on. What did you see and who did you tell?
So what ended up happening was I was walking on the sidewalk and two cars stopped at the light, and there was an intersection in front of the first car that was at the light, and then the second car was behind the first car. And the guys in the second car got out of the car, and they just filled the first car with a bunch of bullet holes. At the time, I didn't know who was being shot, who was doing the shooting. And then a few days later, it ended up coming out that a young man by the name of Robert Arena, I believe his name was shot. And he had a friend along with him for the ride. Robert was a mob affiliate. His friend was not. He was just an innocent bystander. And then years later, someone copped a plea and admitted to ordering the hit, a man by the name of Nick Carozzo. And, from that point on, I was really enthralled by it. And, I just wanted to know everything that I could about the Gambino family. And I didn't tell anyone about it until I spoke with Ken.
Okay, wait, how did this happen? Ken, tell me. So, James, you didn't tell anybody, and what, you picked up the phone and called Ken? How did this whole thing happen? Tell us, Ken, from your point of view.
Well, I mean, after I fell in love with the book and already knew James from his previous book, I pumped it out of him. I wanted to know what got it started. It's amazing that he didn't tell anybody, but I guess he had the fear of God in him. But I told him there's got to be a backstory that took you off the path of whatever else you might have been on and onto this unlikely path. And then he told me the story. And I can tell just from the way he tells it now that he's still a little chary about telling more details. I guess I would be too if I witnessed something like that, because you never feel safe again, right, James?
Correct. It never leaves. And I didn't know what PTSD was back then. But, the nightmares and stuff like that. And I was only 13, so I had no clue. I just thought I was just having nightmares. But, you see something like that, it stays with you. It stays with you, for sure.
Ken mentioned your other books. Would you tell us what those other books are? Tell our audience.
Yeah, sure. I published another book with Ken. It's a nonfiction book. It's a financial self-help book called How Did Warren Buffett Succeed? So it pretty much teaches investors, Main Street investors, how to use the stock market, to accumulate wealth. More specifically, the value investing system of investing, which is what Warren Buffett uses.
Okay, but
And he does it in very simple language that even I could understand, which is what sold me on the idea, because I think a lot of people would love to go into the stock market, but they're not rocket scientists and they aren't likely to become rocket scientists overnight. But if you read James's book, I mean, it really is a step-by-step guide to evaluating stocks and making decisions that was used by Warren Buffett. So it comes with its own proof of concept.
But Warren Buffett made it simple too, don't you think? I mean, I don't want to get off topic here, but he really did, considering the amount of wealth that this man has invested, he keeps it simple, which is what I like that you saw that and wrote a book about it, because it can be simple, even in today's day where things are being driven up and all the Coinbase and all that kind of stuff. I mean, there really is a way to still get involved. So is that book still in print that people can pick it up?
It is. It's published under Story Merchant. It's still in print. You can get it on any online bookstore.
But this book, Gambino the Rise, is a far cry from a book about investing, right?
Yeah.
Gosh, for a guy who is in the financial business, you sure are an incredibly descriptive, beautiful writer.
Thank you.
Yeah. So when you presented this idea to Ken, what did it look like? I'm going to ask that to Ken. What did it look like when he first came to you with this book idea, with the notes and everything?
Well, fortunately, it looked like it's supposed to look. It looked like a manuscript.
Wow.
And so I started reading it, and I realized it was written clearly, eloquently, powerfully. You didn't want to put it down, and it told the story the way storytellers tell stories, where you're sitting there at their feet and they're telling you what went down. And it was a story of an immigrant coming to this country with a copy of Machiavelli's Prince under his arm, reading it on the ship on the way over, and kind of dedicating himself to the Machiavellian principle that persuasion is superior to violence. And of course, as James' book makes clear, Gambino was no stranger to violence, but he was known for his ability to settle mafia disputes and territorial disputes and business disputes without resorting to violence. And so after, a decade or so went by, people started listening to him because it saved them from having to go to the mattresses and, involve their families in full-scale war and revenge.
Right.
So I love the fact that he was distinguished that way, and that James had the insight to describe him in that unique way, and ended up being, isn't it true, the only Don who died in bed out of all the, the famous ones that we know about. And he was supposedly the model for the Godfather.
Right. Don Corleone, right?
Yeah.
Yes.
For Don Corleone. Right. Because he also in The Godfather, was it Godfather 1, where he died of natural causes as well, right? Running through the garden with his grandchild. I was so sad when that happened. I thought, wait a minute, he's not going to come back for number 2. He was so incredible. How could they do that to him? But so they believe that Mario Puzo, the inspiration was in fact Carlo Gambini, right?
Yeah. Yes. That's what they say. They say it was a mixture of Carlo Gambino and a man by the name of Frank Costello, who was a contemporary of Charles Lucky Luciano and Meyer Lansky back in the day. So he's a combination of those two.
How did you do your research for this book? Because I would have been a nervous wreck. I would have put a cloth over the phone and I would have disguised my voice. I mean, really, I would have gone into hiding. How did you do this? What a brave guy.
I went to the Brooklyn Public Library and I asked, listen, they they tried to kick me out of that library so often. It was like an everyday thing after school. I'd go to the library and get as much information as I could from the reference librarian and everyone that worked there. Like, okay, James is back. To the point where they just have like books there for me, like in advance. So I'd walk in there and a librarian would go, "Hey, James, I picked these two out for you, or these three books out for you. Hope it helps you with your research." But it was pretty much grassroots research. I went in there. I read as many books as I could. The internet was obviously out back then, but I mean, it wasn't as informative a medium as it is nowadays. So, I did it through a lot of primary resources in the beginning.
Wow, what a great way to sort of sort through your PTSD, right? Over at the library, right? That, hey, this wasn't my fault that I saw this. Wow, that's pretty incredible. I have to say, that was very astute of you, James. So, how long did it take for you to get this book out? What did your family think? I know that your family came over from Haiti, even though you were born, I believe, in Brooklyn. What did they think that this was going on in your head all this time?
I didn't really get any flack from my family because my dad, he's a reverend, right? So he writes sermons. And so he was always a writer. And in fact, he's retired now and he's getting ready to put out a few books. They're more religious-based books, but he's always been a writer. And I guess that's who I got it from. And from an early age, I was the kind of guy that I would lock myself in my room and read, all night. So I was a voracious reader initially, and naturally, I knew that one day I'd want to write something. So when this happened, I knew, okay, this is going to be my first book project. You know what I mean? And so I wrote it at the age of 15, 16 years old.
Wow.
I wrote it.
Now, very often it takes like forever to get a film made, right, Ken? But you managed to get this into the hands of some of people who just sort of jumped on this. Could you tell me a little bit about what some of the reaction has been to Gambino: The Rise, this book?
Well, I got lucky, if you can call 3 or 4 years getting lucky. I have one film, The Meg, that took 26 years to set it up. This one was considerably less than that. And I think the luck was I ran into a financier called Jules Nasso in Staten Island on another film that I was producing at the time. And the other film was not quite in his wheelhouse. But then during Italian dinner that his grandmother made for us, he mentioned the Gambino family, that he'd kind of grown up with them, in Brooklyn. And I pitched this story, and which was just about to be published at the time. And he absolutely wanted to jump all over it. He was in the middle of complicated negotiations to become head of a studio in Italy at the time, Minerva Pictures, which is now done, and it's being financed by Minerva Pictures along with the China Bridge Capital, a guy named Edward Zing, who's the head of that and who'll produce it along with Jules. And he loved it, and so they kept it for a couple of years, and James knows how agonizing it was for us to wonder if they were still going to do it. And then, one day they basically called up and said, you have 2 days to close this deal. We need to get going on this. And God knows what kind of things were going on in the background in terms of Jules' position and the financing. But films are often that way. They just come together suddenly. And he got it together from his own persistence and determination, and the fact that it's actually perfect for what he was doing, which is running a studio in Rome where a lot of it could be shot, and except, along with on location in Sicily and the south of Italy. So that's what the plan is to do it in Italy, to do it in Italian. And it's going to be directed by Nick Vallelonga, who has known Jules for years. Nick did The Bad Boys and The Comeback Trail, and he thinks James' book is like Shakespeare. I mean, he actually compared it at the Cannes Film Festival to being Shakespearean. And because the characters are larger than life, and the narration is eloquent, and the wisdom that comes from it is, you don't forget it when you walk away. I think that's why people like mafia stories, because you seem to be learning something as you seem to be learning about the moral of life, and the relationship between power and exercise, and between everyday life and suddenly destiny, and that's what James's book is great at depicting, and they loved it, and they're hoping to be shooting by the fall of this year.
Wow.
They're out to cast now, and we expect cast announcements in the next few weeks.
Wow, that's pretty exciting. Hey, if you need any extras, just give me a call. I have no problem with that at all. I mean, there's good buzz about this book, isn't it? And in terms of being made into a film, right? Because there's lots of books about mafia, but as you said, this is compared to Shakespeare. It is beautifully written, very rich. It's a pretty thick book. That's why I called it a Bible, but it's easy to get through because it's impossible to put down. It's impossible to put down. Now my husband's, taking a crack at it. So it's one of those, right? But the fact that over an Italian meal, Ken, this came together is pretty amazing, isn't it?
Yeah, the food, the meal was pretty amazing too. And I've been back a couple of times for her food, and you can never have too much Italian food. I'm going there in April to see how the film is doing, and I love Italy. I used to be a Fulbright professor at the University of Bologna and fell in love with Italy.
So tell us about Italians and the mob today, because it's still there. It's just not as prevalent, right? Like the way it was at the 10 o'clock and 11 o'clock news, particularly back east, right? Could you tell us a little bit about how it functions now?
I think they still function in the same manner. It's just that they're not as powerful as they were back in the day. I think Mayor Giuliani did a really good job of really attacking the mafia, and he used the RICO statute, which was that was the weapon of choice, and it was the right weapon, because what the RICO statute did was it made it so that you can be convicted of a crime simply by association. Whereas before that, so for example, Thomas Dewey, when he was a gangbuster back in like the 20s and 30s, he had to, the evidence that he used was particular to each mobster. You know what I mean? He couldn't attack the mob as a collective group. He had to go after, single mobsters. But after the RICO statute came out in the early 70s, law enforcement agents and politicians were able to use that statute to attack the mob as a whole, as a collective whole. And so he did that to perfection. And he put away all of the top mobsters back in the early 90s, and they haven't recovered since. They haven't recovered. I mean, they still exist, obviously, where people have desires that can't be fulfilled by by society as in general, and where you'll always have an underworld, and you'll always have organizations that that are going to service those needs and those desires, but they're nowhere near as strong as, let's say, the Russian mafia now. And there are other ethnic crime groups that have really taken over. They fill the vacuum.
Yeah, I just got done watching The Offer, which I'm sure you know what that is, right?
Yes.
The making of The Godfather, and then it inspired me to watch the first two. I've still yet to get to the third one.
Hmm.
Um, and I know that this book in particular is being compared to Mario Puzo's
Hmm.
written word because it is so well done and researched. So congratulations to you.
Thank you.
Are there
Thank you.
any parting words you'd like to tell us, either of you, about the Italian American community that's responded to this book or the film coming out? Would you like to share?
Um, I'll just piggyback on what Ken said. I think we're fascinated by the mob. You know, the violence and stuff is exciting to watch on a screen, but um, they represent like the dichotomy of the immigrant and American family, and our social fabric. I'll even go as far as to say our social fabric. Um, the mafia was created in Sicily um, as a means to defend the citizens of Sicily from foreign invaders.
Mm,
So at its inception, it was a good idea. You know what I mean? And what it became is what it became. But
right.
at its heart, at the heart of the mafia, you have family. Um, you have society, you have culture, music, and I think that apart from just the violence as as a separate entity of what goes on with the mafia, those things are what I've probably watched The Godfather one and The Godfather two 80 times. You know what I mean? And in The Godfather one, we could count on one hand the number of violent scenes that were depicted in that movie. There are two
It's
sequences
true.
for the most part, two violent
Yeah.
sequences. The rest is just us with the Corleones at the dinner table, just us getting involved and wrapped into the family business. And so I think that's what's fascinated me about the mafia. Really getting, and like I said, I grew up with Italians when I lived in Canarsie, so really engaging with the families and stuff like that, and that's what I wanted to depict in the book, more than anything else.
Yeah, I felt that. And I am full-blooded Italian, by the way, on both sides of my family. So I felt
Awesome.
that. I felt that you really captured that in terms of family and also respect. That's a big thing in the Italian culture, respect.
Sure. Sure.
Um, Ken, would you any parting words about the film, about being the literary manager for this and getting it to the point where it's going to be made, which is practically impossible?
Well, as I said, we got lucky, and
Yeah.
it is impossible to get films made these days. Every time I do one, I think it's going to be easier, but it's not. It's always harder. And all I can say is I'm looking forward to the sequel to this. James is working uh, on the next one, Gambino, the Triumph, I call it, which
Mm,
is in the first book he kind of rises to power and ends up with the reins of the families in his hands. And then
right.
the second one, James, you might want to say a couple of words about what that covers.
Sure. And so Gambino, the rise, obviously charts Gambino's course from Sicily here to the US, and then his rise to the top of the Gambino family by taking out his predecessor, Albert Anastasia.
Mm,
And you mentioned The Offer, Deb, which kind of went, uh, they spoke mostly about, I believe it was like the Colombo family. But Gambino was involved in that melee as well. He
mm,
was one of the actors on that show, and Gambino, the Triumph, is kind of going to go a little bit more into detail about how he was able to take over the commission as a whole. So the first book was him taking over the Gambino family specifically, and the
mm.
second book is going to be how he used his Machiavellian genius really to take over all five families as a whole. So I'm looking forward to finishing that.
I don't know how you find the time. Like I said, you're also by day You're in finance, and I believe you have a baby on the way. Is that correct?
I do.
Or
I do.
yeah.
My wife and I, Katrina, we're expecting November 16th. It's a little baby
Wow.
girl.
Thank you for taking the time. But it sounds like you have more than 24 hours in your day to get all this done. I don't know how you do it. Ken, real quick, if you don't mind, a quick shout out to some of the well-known films that people would know that you've been behind. Would you tell us?
Well, the latest one was The Meg with Jason Statham, and
Mm-hmm.
The
Yeah.
Last Valentine with Betty White,
Mm.
Hysteria with Maggie Gyllenhaal, Erased with Aaron Eckhart, all the way back to Joe Somebody with Tim Allen. We've done about 30 films altogether. So
Very
it's
exciting.
It's been fun.
What a wonderful team. Go ahead. I'm sorry, Ken. I cut you off.
That's it. Great.
Yeah.
Thank you
Wonderful
so
team.
much for inviting us.
Thank you so
I'm
much, Deb.
very excited about all of this. Love the book. Please, people, pick it up. James Pierre Gambino, The Rise. It's wonderfully written. Like I said, you're not going to want to put this down. I couldn't. I was a little concerned. I thought, my gosh, how am I going to get through it for my interview? I couldn't stop. I actually canceled plans. I continued to read it. I kept thumbing through it. I said, gosh, did that really happen? I don't want to give anything away. So I do want people to pick up the book. And Ken, thank you for joining us, because it's going to be a very exciting journey for the two of you getting this film made. And I'm excited to see it. So thank you both very much for joining us on our show, Deborah Kobylt Live, on any audio platform as well, whether it's iHeart, Amazon. Just put in our name and you'll find us. Thank you
Thanks, Deborah.
again. Yeah, tell your friends about the show, and we'll see you all next